Mr Acting Deputy President, some things in politics are all too predictable. The government says last night's 2016 budget was a budget for jobs and growth. They blame the former Labor government for the successive budget deficits that are now forecast to stretch out into the next decade. The Labor opposition says it's a budget for millionaires. They contend that most Australian families will miss out on any benefit, and that simply isn't fair. These scripts could have been written, and probably were written, well in advance, and the same lines are going to be repeated ad nauseum over the next 8 weeks. If you step back from the highly partisan debate, the majority of commentators, and there are commentators aplenty these days, have found the budget distinctly underwhelming. Indeed, the best that some could say last night was that Treasurer Morrison had to some extent followed the philosophy of the ancient Greek physician Hippocrates, insofar as the budget appears to have been designed to do the least harm. All too often these days, politics seems to involve the triumph of low expectations. Regrettably, however, I don't think this as a Hippocratic budget. Regrettably, it will do harm. It will do harm by omission. It's not what is in the budget, a tax cut that maybe could buy a meat pie and some very modest tax breaks for business. That's not the problem. It's the things that aren't in the budget that are the bigger issue. For a budget that is supposed to be all about jobs and growth, it is inexcusable that it fails to acknowledge the crisis of manufacturing in this country, not just in the automaking sector, but in our steel industry, with manufacturing in this nation as a percentage of GDP now well under double digits, unlike comparable developed nations. Australia's share of manufacturing as a share of GDP has slipped from 12% in 2004 to well under 7% now, and is expected to slide even further to below that of nations that never had a significant manufacturing base. For instance, Botswana at 6% and Rwanda at 5%. Contrast that with Germany, the jobs and economic powerhouse of Europe, where 22% of their GDP is derived from manufacturing, including smart, advanced manufacturing. The budget papers refer to the massive decline of some 60,000 jobs in the manufacturing sector in the past year. However, they conspicuously fail to acknowledge the 200,000 jobs at risk, especially in South Australia and Victoria, and flow-on effects throughout the rest of the nation when the automaking sector shuts down at the end of 2017. A strong, viable steel industry is essential for our nation's manufacturing sector. Arrium, the producer of structural steel in this country, the steel that is used in concrete pours for new buildings and so much more, is a critical part of our manufacturing sector. Indeed, it is an essential part of its foundation. Because Arrium, which is currently in administration, is doing it tough, and an entire city, Whyalla, relies on steelmaking to survive, although I am confident that Administrator Mark Mentha can revive its fortunes if we have the right policies in place. If we keep going as we have been, we will soon no longer be a manufacturing nation of significance, because unless we change Commonwealth procurement laws to ensure that the social and economic benefits of local procurement are given priority, not just with the $59 billion of Commonwealth funds that are used to procure goods and services each year, but with those tens of billions of dollars more that go to the states and local government for infrastructure. Unless that happens, Arrium and so many other companies will not have a fair chance to prosper, and indeed could fail. Our anti-dumping regime and non-conforming building products from overseas are two other important areas that need urgent reform to give Australian manufacturing and jobs a fair go. Of course, members of the government, especially from those from my home state of South Australia, can rightly trumpet the government's recent announcement in respect to naval shipbuilding and say that all will be well. Of course, I wholeheartedly welcome the much-delayed commitment concerning construction of the next generation of 12 submarines, and praise my colleagues for being part of that success. But there's still a long way to go before the contracts are signed. There's an even longer way to go before steel is cut, up to 7 years when we will see most of these jobs materialise. There will certainly need to be continuing pressure on whoever forms the next government to see the commitments that have been made in regard to naval construction, naval shipbuilding and submarine building are fulfilled in full. In any case, it will certainly be some time before the benefits of new naval construction re-energise South Australia's shipbuilding and defence industry sectors. In the meantime, the Navy's new supply ships, worth some $2 billion, seem destined to be built in Spain, but I note the contracts have not yet been signed. But a contract has been signed for Australia's next Antarctic research icebreaker, a $500 million build that will be constructed in Romania. South Australia's shipbuilders are still going to face some very serious challenges before the new naval construction projects come online, with at least 700 direct jobs due to go in South Australia by the end of 2018, the so-called Valley of Jobs Death, with several thousand more jobs affected through the supply chain and multiplier effects. The budget does very little for the South Australian workers, contractors and small to medium businesses in manufacturing supply chains that face immediate and grave challenges. As is so often the case, the government's ideological, I say, blinkered commitment to free trade agreements also fails to consider the extent of impacts on local manufacturing opportunities. I've already referred to the importance of local procurement. However, the budget references to the TPP procurement agreement are certainly light on detail and could compromise Australian jobs by restricting the ability of local procurement agreements that would take into account the great benefits of buying local. But it could get worse, much worse, if Australia signs on to the greatest procurement treaty you've never heard of, to quote Graham Phillipson of Government News. If Australia goes on to sign the WTO agreement on government procurement, that could well make illegal attempts by state governments such as South Australia and Victoria to ensure that the local benefits of procurement are considered. It could also mean that any attempts by this parliament to strengthen our procurement laws could be challenged in the WTO. South Australia's manufacturing crisis, and indeed around the country, is real and immediate and will only intensify in coming months. If the government were a physician, it would be standing by the bedside, passive and ineffective, wringing its hands, telling everyone that it hoped for the best while the patient struggles for life. This indifference struggles to Australia's iconic wine industry. While the government has made some unambiguously welcome steps towards promoting Australian wine to the world and dealing with aspects of the wine equalisation tax, it has failed to acknowledge the Winemakers Federation's urgent plea to phase out now the much-lauded wine equalisation tax rebate on bulk and unbranded wine. That tax has distorted and damaged the sector, pushing many hundreds of wine grape growers and winemakers to the economic brink. The government's failure to listen to the industry and to do the right thing by beginning the phase-out now, rather than in 2019, will cost Australian winemakers dearly. The budget could also have provided the government with the opportunity to reconsider other measures that can only exacerbate economic challenges for regional Australia. The government's failure to scrap the much-feared backpackers tax due to commence on July 1 is certainly another body blow for farmers wanting to get the job done in regional Australia with our periodic labour shortages. This silly, counterproductive tax needs to go now. There are also some very serious questions in regard to the health, education and aged care aspects of the budget. The government certainly has not restored the health and education funding that was cut away in 2014. The budget papers also blandly refer to efficiencies of $1.2 billion over 4 years through changes in the scoring matrix in the aged care funding instrument. This could prove deeply damaging to a significant number of our senior citizens. The government certainly needs to spell out its plans in detail to show exactly what is proposed in this very sensitive area, and they need to give an absolute guarantee that none of Australia's elderly will be disadvantaged. It would be remiss of me today not to also point out the government's failure once again to come with the enormous social and economic impacts of problem gambling. Despite the government announcing a welcome announcement last week to clamp down on online gambling, including illegal offshore online gambling sites, there does not appear to be any money set aside for the enforcement and implementation of these policies. I fear that this is very much a treading water budget from a government desperately anxious not to sink at the July 2nd poll, and I understand that. Time will tell whether the government's gamble will pay off. No doubt there will be a strident partisan debate between Coalition and Labor in coming weeks, but it remains to be seen whether either side will really address some of the really important challenges that our nation faces, especially the jobs crisis in our manufacturing industries.
Thank you, Senator Xenophon.